what the world looks like from Beijing, by and large, the conversation is not about the West or about Trump. It's about what's happening inside China. The Chinese default position is that the West is here to manage or stop the rise of China. The ways in which that's likely to happen are by compromising energy imports, food imports, and to have strategic leverage over China, which Taiwan, from a Chinese perspective, looks like a sort of forward attack base. Iran's primary concern is regime stability. That's the signature that keeps China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, very different countries, keeps them all together. Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Malaysia, India have forward-looking plans. But here in Europe, I think our default is we would just like time to stand still. We probably go into a world that's more volatile, and volatility is great if you're a hedge fund. Volatility is obviously more difficult if you're long only, and you're trying to think about long trends and how those play out. We are probably back in an age of state-on-state violence, where states are going to look to use their competitive advantage against each other through the use of force.
So if you're watching on YouTube or listening to this podcast, it's a little bit different in that we recorded Peter Frankopan, the author of The Silk Roads, a few weeks back, and he's been reflecting on the Silk Roads 10 years on. And then in the interim period, we had the dual attack on Iran, and so we asked Peter to come back and just to give us a top-up. And if you stay with the episode, which we hope you will, there's a short update of Peter's thinking as we all try and process the implications of this and whether there are conclusions being reached that in several months may turn out to be hopelessly optimistic or unrealistically pessimistic. So hope you enjoy the great Peter Frankopan. As we move into an era where the political, military and economic dominance of the West is coming under pressure, the sense of uncertainty is unsettling. And while we ponder where the next threat may come from, the network and connections are quietly being knitted together across the spine of Asia, or rather they are being restored. The Silk Roads are rising again. Those are the closing lines of the majestic opus that is The Silk Roads, a new history of the world, written 10 years ago and proving remarkably prophetic. The author, Peter Frankopan of Oxford University, created a profound and enduring book that has been devoured around the world, and with it has made its own mark in history. It's been translated into more than 45 languages, sold almost 3 million copies worldwide, been a New York Times bestseller, described as breathtaking and addictively readable, and read by leaders East and West, including Chinese leader Xi Jinping. It's also available on audio and an inspiration for exhibitions at the British Museum. So Peter Frankopan, a pleasure to welcome you back in person to the Money Maze podcast.
Well, I was here 4 years ago, I think, but those are the days of COVID. So we were all kept far apart, but I'm in your fantastic new studio. So thank you for having me.
It's great. You indeed appeared in December 2021. You've just joined our advisory board, which we're very excited about. And as a recap, you're a professor of global history at Worcester College, Oxford, the director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research, and your focus historically has been on the Byzantine Empire, the Mediterranean, the Balkans, Caucasus, Russia, as well as the interdependence of Islam and Christianity. All very topical and explains why you're very much in demand. And our friend and co-founder, Will Campion, tells me that you are not only a great cricketer, but you're also a very handy fives player.
It's a little bit niche, I think, even for those with the great variances of interest in the Money Maze. Or maybe do separate podcasts, maybe a live broadcast of the fives court running around hitting the balls with irons.
Well, a few things stayed with me because I came and listened to you at the Clifton Literary Festival several years ago, and you made this comment that 75% of the world's population live east of Istanbul, and we in the West have a propensity to live with our eyes stitched closed. And I'd like to start with this question, which is when you began this book, what was the inspiration and what was the expectation?
I didn't have any expectations. I was about to turn 40. And, had the position at this wonderful university at Oxford and quite a wide range of interests. I mean, geographically, I'm broadly speaking, anything east of the Vistula, anything east of Istanbul has been things that I've been interested in, partly because of that's where global populations are based, partly because of networks and connections and exchange of religions and so on. All the world's great religions, by and large, are from Asia. We think of Christianity as being quintessentially European, but I can promise you, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth are not in Europe. And I think the process of trying to think about how to join up big history in a way that was both readable, engaging, but also emphasised what happens when you connect to each other. We live in a network age. We talk about that word sort of easily, and we think that digital networks are changing everything. But infrastructure, connections, hard resources, new technologies, ideas from the past are key. So that figure of 75%, you could keep escalating. So it's about 75% of the world's hydrocarbons sit in that region, about 85% of the world's rice production. Rare earths, both in availability and in processing, and rare earths are not all rare and so on, that's a whole other story. But you see the concentrations of what we should probably be looking at. And some of it, like you said in your very generous introduction, that made me heat up a little bit with pride and embarrassment, is that Asia is home to more than all the other continents combined. And that means that things like climate change, things like consumption, things like energy, things like water, that's probably where we should be looking to for opportunities and challenges. So when I wrote the book, it was how to join up lots of bits and pieces together, how to take a long view that covers a couple of thousand years, and to do it with enough detail that my academic colleagues would be happy with. And my expectations were more or less zero, because I'd been to enough drinks parties with, not with you and with Will, because you're much too interesting and engaging and much too polite. But when I'd say I worked on Central Asia, or I worked on Chinese views of the West, or worked on what Iran meant in history, people thought I didn't think I was mad, but they thought it was a strange way to spend my life. It turns out that those kind of fault lines, crossroads, networks, India, Pakistan, China, Southeast Asia, those have always been incredibly important, and it's very clear to me that that's where our current, mainstream challenges and opportunities, whether you're an investor listening to this, geopolitics, security, national security or otherwise, but also all these escalating ways we should think about the world. But I didn't expect anyone would read it. And in fact, when I got my dummy book cover back from my American publisher, which had a picture of a dump truck and a picture of a Persian relief, and I didn't quite, I'm not emotional, not very emotional, but I did have a gut lump in my throat thinking, well, that means no one's going to read it. But Emma Eubank, who's my cover designer here in the UK, I sent her a few ideas or a few images that I thought were great. And the image that's on the cover of the book is from the Great Mosque in Isfahan. And it captures exactly the kind of the richness, the colour, the wealth, the vibrancy. So that when you start conversations, for example, in the introduction, I say, 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, the great universities weren't at Caltech or MIT or Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, but they were places that are very obscure and exotic. So places like Isfahan or Merv or Bukhara, Samarkand, places that people might have heard of, but don't quite believe, that this is where these were the engines of global intellectual thought, power and trade and commerce.
So you have the benefit of the historian's lens, and I think that many of us fall prey to the daily noise and feel that change is greater than we've ever experienced. And a higher level question, is that because of our age, or is it because of the age in which we live?
Look, I think we all think we're living in a world of extraordinary turbulence, but I wouldn't swap 2025, however dangerous it might seem, with 1939 or with 1914 or 1917. Pick a date in the past. I think it is hard because we're bombarded with news sources. We're very personality driven. So people know the name of the leader of China, but they can't tell you the name of any other Politburo member. Same in Russia. Probably Lavrov has a high enough profile, but beyond that, Russian Prime Minister, Minister of Economics, let alone pick a state, pick a country, including really important ones. I think some of it is that the news cycle is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, in the world of finance, you have the US, you have Europe, and then you've got emerging markets, which means everybody else, right? And that's probably 85% of the world's population. And probably it's time to break away from some of those kinds of designations where things like the rate of change in Latin America, and particularly its trade with places like China, have been on a scale that has been absolutely biblical in the growth, or just China on its own. So in 2000, when 2001, China joined the WTO, its economy was about $1 trillion. Now it's 16, 17, touching 18 trillion. And so those changes, they really do make a difference in real time. Accelerate into that, the highest population we've ever seen in history, the new technology we've got that allows us to connect quicker, move around quicker, move bits of information faster, then you're going to accelerate some of those pressures, because decision-making when you're going at speed is more dangerous and difficult than when you're going slowly. So, we know that when we drive our cars. I'm not a pilot, but I suspect flying planes is the same thing. And those margins for error start to become narrower. So So the world, the decade, as Kevin Rudd calls it, the decade of living dangerously, regardless of one's political persuasion or where you are listening to the world to this, it's quite hard to not think past that. But I promise you it could be a lot worse.
So let's talk about some specific stops on the Silk routes which you have examined. I mean, I think over the last 50 years, I would observe we'd moved from two power blocks, US and Russia. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall. For a moment, it seemed like it might be unipolar, and now we're, in a world that appears to be multipolar with China, India, the malevolent thorn that is Putin's Russia, and these other immense countries. And I'd like to talk about a few of them. And the logical place, I guess, for me is to start with China and the Belt and Road Initiative, which didn't seem so long ago that Cameron and Osborne here in the UK were cozying up to China, and now we've gone, into a very different environment. What appeared to some as sort of laudable appears now to others as maybe more insidious. How do you reflect on the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, as usual, we started asking maybe the right question years too late. So people have now heard of the Belt and Road and think it's a terrible thing. Major funding stopped in about 2018, which is quite a long time ago. That's long before COVID. That was the Russian World Cup in football, where perhaps looking back on it, that should have had a boycott attached to it as well. So look, I think Belt and Road was designed as a signature of China's foreign economic policy to achieve lots of different things. And there is a master plan element to it, but it's also pretty disparate. So some of it was about developing the western parts of China, which are economically undeveloped, home to minority populations, some of whom have had a lot of exposure in the levels of persecution, like Uyghurs, for example. Some of it was about moving China's manufacturing capacity into neighbouring countries, which is not in itself necessarily a bad thing. As China switches its economic model or tries to switch its economic model, finding new markets, that doesn't seem to me entirely implausible. And then the idea of galvanizing infrastructure to increase connectivity is familiar to anybody who works in development economics. That the challenge was that because the Belt and Road seemed to present like it was monolithic, it started to attract commentary and criticism, sometimes justifiably and sometimes otherwise, particularly for things like debt diplomacy, that China was somehow lending in order to trap. And that became a narrative that managed to get away from Beijing, I suppose. And I'm not here to say whether that's good or bad, but just to say that that's what happened. In fact, if you look at the continent of Africa as a whole, about 12% of total debt is owed to China or Chinese entities or state-owned entities, which is reasonably modest. So the challenge in emerging parts of the world, developing parts of the world, and middle and low-income countries is there's a almost insatiable appetite for infrastructure, for roads, for railways, for clean power, clean energy, renewables, for sanitation, for schools, for facilities. And that money's got to come from somewhere. And I can promise you, in almost every single country I work on, it would be great if that came from the UK or from Europe or from the US or from the World Bank. But in a lot of cases, the country risk attached is either too high or the returns are exorbitant. So China's left as the only show in town. So there have been a few blow-ups, some of them quite high profile, where China has lent perhaps irresponsibly, perhaps thoughtlessly, but always at the invitation of the host country. And some of those have created strategic, military, potential problems. So, for example, the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka is the kind of the poster child of a kind of bad project. But it was a project where the developers defaulted pretty much straight away. Sri Lanka struggles to attract foreign direct investment anyway. Dollar-denominated loans, it all went wrong, and China was left holding a port that Sri Lanka wanted that potentially has some long-term use. But you as a financier, you don't want to be holding a distressed asset that has no value. And if it suddenly in 20, 30, 40 years' time, you can renegotiate and you can put in Chinese naval vessels, which you can't currently do, then maybe there's a value. But bad debt is bad debt. Someone sits at the end of that. And sometimes we can think that China doesn't operate by the same rules of money that normal lending institutions do. But most of the projects, The Economist evaluating 10 years of Belt and Road in 2023, most of the projects have been pretty good. Most of them have worked quite well. Most of them have invested in infrastructure reasonably sensibly. And that doesn't seem to me, if you are a rising power, to look for alliances, to look for friendships, to look for networks that can enhance your own economy, that doesn't look to me that it's necessarily threatening. The problem is I think we didn't benchmark what China was doing. We didn't think about what our response would be. We did a lot of finger wagging, saying don't do this and don't borrow, but we haven't invested in any way or shape or form in a way that would be meaningful. So we don't teach children about other parts of the world, for example, in schools. We talked about that before, and I think, and we don't, and I think we don't think about what these other places mean to us beyond how can we boost our UK economy or the global economy. And it turns out that there's no such thing as a regional economy anymore. Everything is globalized. All supply chains have heavy global components. And here we suddenly find ourselves asking questions about resilience of basic supplies, not just critical minerals and rare earths, but the fact that China has a monopoly position in a lot of industries that mean that we in the West are potentially very highly exposed. And the only way out of it, which is what Trump is trying to do, force manufacturing back to the US, which triggers inflation and makes goods certainly more expensive, possibly worse. So I think we're at that point where those ideas about globalization that Cameron and Osborne seem to embrace, maybe they weren't wrong to do that, but we should have thought about what the guardrails should be. And I suppose to put it in a wider context, we didn't think about that with social media. We didn't think about that with climate. The cheap goods that have helped European and Western economies grow for the last 20 years came at huge pollution and warming risks and costs to countries with lower labour forces and lower environmental protection. We didn't put those guardrails in place with what Russia meant. So one of the questions is, how should we be regulating to stop similar kinds of problems come towards us? And I spent this morning on AI, doing AI stuff, and these conversations look very familiar around, are we going to spend 10 years down the line, are we going to say we were too late with that too? But China, I think, charting its rise, seeing Belt and Road, I think we misdiagnosed, didn't understand what it was. And when we did, we then got it wrong by assuming everything was malign rather than picking apart the bits that really do matter and perhaps the bit that were less important.
So I note in your epilogue to the update to the Silk Roads, you make the point which surprised me. In fact, the biggest investor in Africa in the last decade has been the Gulf and Middle Eastern countries, which
not by a bit, by substantial. Last year, UAE invested 3 times more, almost 4 times more than China did. So there are new players, and in the international relations community, the current vogue is to call them middle powers, which means they have capacity to behave in ways that allow them to use their leverage. Old-fashioned historians like me just say that's what diplomatic policy looks like. You work out what it is you want and what you need. You work out what the future is going to look like. You make sure you're not caught out of position, and you prepare. And I think a lot of the countries that I write about in my book, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Malaysia, India, have forward-looking plans that like in a business plan, doesn't mean you're going to get it right. Sometimes a business plan means you get it wrong because you don't course correct. But here in Europe, I think our default is we would just like time to stand still. We're not comfortable with these new threats. But if you were to say to any frontline European politician, what do you think Europe in 2040 looks like, or Europe in 2050? They'd struggle to recognise what that question is. And that's not because we're democracies and we have elections to worry about. It's that we've forgotten that process of thinking ahead.
I don't want to leave China without asking you one question, because as I re-listened to that interview, you made the observation that China historically wasn't a colonizing nation. When we look at some of the stats, Chinese shipyards built more tonnage, as you've written, in 2024 alone than the US has built since the end of the Second World War. We've got military exhibitions, should we say, going on around the Taiwan Straits, etc. Is that still right?
Well, that China's not a colonising power.
Yes.
China was a coloniser for what's now mainland China. So 300 years ago, China was about half the size to what it is now. The Qing moved into Xinjiang and into Tibet, into Mongolia, but it didn't build a grand global empire in the way that European states did. So 100 years ago, just before the First World War, Belgium controlled most of West Africa. The Portuguese had a global empire across multiple continents. So the Ottomans, lots of people did. China, I think, had a different trajectory. So are there pinch points now? Hong Kong, Macau, Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, and of course Taiwan, from a Chinese perspective, I guess, a missing piece. But I think by and large, there's a single Chinese military base abroad in Djibouti, in the Red Sea. But otherwise, you don't find Chinese military bases. Now, it might be that changes. There are places which could potentially be dual use. There'd be lots of anxiety about the port of Piraeus, for example, in Athens, which is controlled by a Chinese state-owned enterprise, that may have some kind of dual use military capacity, but that would require the Greek government. And I'd find it hard to imagine that China will start parking aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, but you never know. But I think that I spent a lot of time trying to understand things from other people's perspectives. But by and large, the Chinese default position is that the West is here to manage or stop the rise of China. And therefore, the ways in which that's likely to happen are by compromising energy imports, food imports, and have strategic leverage over China, of which Taiwan, from a Chinese perspective, looks like a sort of forward attack base. Now, that might sound crazy to all of us. That might sound beyond the realms of conceivability that there might one day be a Western attack on mainland China using Taiwan. But Chinese IR specialists, when they talk about it, no, they're not stupid. Will say, look at interventions in the Middle East, look at interventions in Afghanistan, look at what happens in Ukraine. Actually, the West quite often weighs in on decisions that it thinks preserve its own stability or its own advantage. And we can't exclude the idea that the US fleet that's in the Indo-Pacific may turn out to be not just conducting freedom of navigation operations. And I think what we're missing is how to allay those fears while keeping a strategic balance. So I think that China, in terms of its willingness to invest militarily in other countries, it's willing to sell its hardware. It's willing to do that quite aggressively. We've seen drone raids over Sudan in the last month using Chinese kit. Very heavy militarization of pretty good quality stuff in the engagement between India and Pakistan recently, where Chinese military kit outperformed Russian kit that India relied on, and outperformed, what we can outperformed French Rafale jets. That China's quite a good marketer of high-tech kit and a military kit too. But I don't think it's the same type of power, at least not yet, that looks in terms of how does it go to take over space territory and so on. That might change. That there is a large group, particularly with young people in China, that keep looking at the maps of Russia and talking about what land was taken by the Russians over the course of the last 200 years. Very lively debates about names of cities and whether those should be changed. So that might well be something that comes in the future. But for now, China looks to me like a country that is pretty cautious. It's very risk averse. It doesn't engage in a malign way within global institutions. It tries to blend and build alliances. It's not averse to finding the dark arts to convince people to vote alongside it. But it's keen to say that it wants reform within its own terms. And that doesn't mean it's not a threat, but that looks very different to me to what Russia does, for example.
So let's shift down to India, the other great population power. They watched much of this. They have enacted their India East Act policy. They've got a much better demographic profile, and I think more home to more billionaires after the US and China than anywhere else, with an interesting investment dimension, because accessing their equity markets, has proved to be more tricky for Western investors, and certainly the valuation, India looks expensive, China looks cheap, one's got more geopolitical risks. And how do you assess India's ambitions?
I think it's a very good question. I've already given quite long answers. Look, I think India quite rightly wants to be in every club it can join. I think it wants to play at every table. And that doesn't seem to me to be either a bad idea. In fact, it looks like a very good one. So India's got very close relationships with Russia. It currently has become Europe's largest source of oil because of imports that come from Russia and recycled through India. It's allowed and enabled and put mechanics in place to allow Russian capital to find homes through Indian banks, which some in the West are very unhappy about, perhaps not surprisingly. It has quite a close relationship with Iran, investments in Chabahar in particular. It's looked to increase its investments and its relationships with the Middle East as a whole, with the Gulf region. It has the IMEC, the India-Middle East corridor, ending up in Haifa. And, you don't need to be a geopolitical specialist to work out that a Hindu country, predominantly Hindu country with lots of minorities, but the largest one being Muslim ones, who are under pretty severe pressure in political mainstream and through the rule of law, to be able to have relationships with Shia Muslim country in Iran, with Sunni Muslims in the Gulf, with what looks like now almost exclusively Jewish leadership in Israel, where minorities have been pushed out as well. That requires quite an ability to stay ahead of oncoming traffic. It's a difficult set to play, but India is looking eastwards as well, as you mentioned. Its trouble spots, I think, its relationship with China. But that very tense relationship that has gone back many decades, actually, to the war in the early 1960s, and has seen military confrontation at the border in the last 5 years, has largely dampened down, primarily because of very heavy lobbying by Indian business interests to try to find a channel through, because India and China are both extremely important trade partners to each other. So I think that there's lots of the geopolitical stuff that India wants to be friends with everybody, while playing its own course. But for example, it's quite tricky if you're taking top level military hardware from Russia, but to then be a cornerstone of US Indo-Pacific relationships through the Quad. So at some point, you probably have to try and navigate whether you're being forced to take sides. And it looks to me that world of the US are being very insistent of saying this is the price of friendship, this is what you get in return. That may not necessarily be a crazy policy that Trump is pursuing either, but it's very clear that that's what the US are trying to do, is to say you either pick me or you pick our competitors, China, to some extent Russia, Iran, and so on. And the question will be what decision the government in India will take on that. And it doesn't look to me clear. And you've looked at India as an investor for a long, long time. Those walls and barriers have stayed up. It's a tricky place to invest for lots of different reasons. And probably, although the demographics, median age is much lower than China, the opportunities are much greater. The climate factor is obviously something to think about for the short and mid-term. But there's lots of positive signs on infrastructure investment that means that India today looks very different to what it did 10 years ago.
Well, before we leave Asia, only because I'm on a plane to Indonesia on Saturday to hopefully meet up with my son, who's travelling around that part of the world. So that's a serious.
Tough life. I hope he's there for work.
Yeah, I hope that since it's a year between school and university,
okay, he's allowed. No, good for him.
Ready for work. But Indonesia, 280 million people, fourth largest country in the world, absolutely central to nickel, electric car battery sort of equation. Again, it's so easy just to forget these huge populations and countries. And when you think about those others, how are they siding with the great powers?
Well, look, Indonesia is one of my favourite countries. Okay, the island of Java has a bigger population than Russia, right? That would tell you, if you're thinking of it as an investor, you might make your calculations slightly differently. But we miss all this stuff, I think, most of the time here. So in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, there've been major boycotts of McDonald's, of KFC, of Starbucks, because these are perceived to be American businesses, and the way in which the US is behaving in Gaza and Israel, and support they're giving to the government of Netanyahu, has led to public protests and to shuttering of these shops. And that is a kind of reality, I think, that affects multi-billion-dollar corporations, that if you're not paying attention, then things start to look complicated in a country with 230 million people. And then you mentioned their importance in nickel, in particular, battery supply. Indonesia, like other countries, is trying to play both ways. So they've got a reasonably close relationship with the US and with Australia. They've just conducted joint naval operations. A couple of weeks after that, they conduct their first naval operation with the Russian Navy. Talk about having a Russian air base and possibly a Chinese air base in parts of Indonesia, set the feathers flying. And, if you're Indonesia, feathers flying and local neighbouring governments or governments far away getting in a flat probably gives you leverage if you know what you want in return. So it doesn't just work where the US will say, this is the price for being my friend. Other states are going to play that game too. And I think one of those questions about global security is, what does that envelope look like, and who is providing comfort in a world where we are probably back in an age of state-on-state violence, where states are going to look to use their competitive advantage against each other through the use of force. And that architecture that we grew up with of the UN, of an ability to try and dampen things down, maybe the threat to nuclear weapons was like that. But now the problem is the costs and the ability to conduct sub-threshold attacks on infrastructure, sabotage through cyber, etc. Those costs are so low that we probably go into a world that's more volatile. And volatility is great if you're a hedge fund. Volatility is obviously more difficult if you're long only, and you're trying to think about long trends and how those play out, because small things can have major and catastrophic impacts. One of the things I've been working on recently is on fragility, and why is it that big empires can be brought down by little pinpricks. But that is not just can happen, that's usually what happens.
And just in the context of Indonesia and nickel, I am in the process of reading that terrific book, Material World by Ed Conway, and that's illuminating as to the whole supply chains and unexpected sources of these.
Right, Ed's book is great. It reminds us that although we're all very excited about software and capabilities of our tech, if you don't have the kit to build it, then you're in trouble. And, we've seen the kind of energy demands that AI have. I mean, I'd put in the same category things like water in a warming world. The ability to cool, the ability to keep servers running, means that those are risks. And I think that there's a whole host of risks from the natural world, a whole host of risks from the geopolitical world that are not just underpriced. I think they're unpriced and they're not built in at all. And I'd be much more worried about shocks than I would be about opportunities. We're talking at a time when the markets are nice and full. We're past the threshold of Liberation Day. Everybody thinks that Trump is back in the saddle and we're going to be okay, and all these deals are going to be all right with the penguins, uninhabited islands, as well as with China. But there are lots and lots of things that can go wrong, and small shocks can have magnifying impacts.
And one country that you've written about know well, and I did just want to ask a specific question, and that's Iran. Aging theocracy, I think youngest population in the world, but, with maybe a mismatch of expectations, fabulous history. How might that play out?
Iran's primary concern, and of the theocrats, the mullahs who run it, is regime stability. I mean, that's the signature that keeps China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, very different countries, keeps them all together, which is that they have the same three aims, which is regime stability, and regime stability. And if you can find tools that you can help that through surveillance, for example, but those things are easy if you can control all the airwaves, literally as well as all the networks. So, for example, when there were protests in 2022 and 2023. The Iranian leadership saw those as opportunities to work out where pockets of resistance were, right? So you can identify who's unhappy and you can deal with them, sometimes through force, but also through high levels of intimidation, surveillance, or whatever. So if your aim is to stay in power, then you've got unlimited flexibility of what that posture might look like. And I think Iran is more pragmatic than often we think about here. It's not just people sort of thinking that there's a religious conviction. It's about how do you make sure that the structure stays in place. And, Iran, as I write in my book, has fought 3 Cold Wars for the last 40 years with about 2% of the US defense budget, concurrently taking on Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Great Satan, the US. And at some point, you have to recognize that they are quite good at what they do. There's a huge human price for it. But there are question marks, I think, about how Iran sees itself in the wider world. That's something I'm going to spend a lot of time later this year working on, about reading through better what Iranian IR scholars, business people, and as far as you can, to work out what does Central Asia look like to Iranian scholars, because it's really important that we understand that better here in the West.
Well, we can't leave this area without talking about those Central Asian countries. I think you probably travel more than anyone I know to that point. How many flights have you taken to Central Asia in the last 2 years?
I've been there a bit. I just got back from Tajikistan, where the question's all about water and glacier melt, and that's a real critical problem. Central Asia is warming twice as fast as most other parts of the world. Kyrgyzstan has lost 1,000 glaciers in the last 20 years. And so water availability, I think, is something that we should all be thinking about. And it's not just Central Asia. These are countries we don't really know. That's India and Pakistan. It's critical. And the Colorado, places in the United States, it's something which I think the alarm bells are ringing pretty loud, and we should be thinking quite hard about what those cascade impacts might be. But yeah, no, I know Central Asia well.
And of course, that brings us to Russia, because they were all part of the sort of, or certainly connected for so long. You put a lovely expression in the last interview, which is Russia has historically played a weak hand well. How do you appraise their hand now?
I would never disagree with myself. I'm too polite to disagree with anybody else. I think that's probably about right. That sounds very, very wise.
Maybe I said it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the challenge is that I think Putin's not quite sure what it is that he wants, but he has unlimited resources and time to be able to disrupt, and we have to work out what that means for us here in the UK and in Europe, how much we're really willing to lean in, to work out what implications it has for us directly, as well as as well as indirectly. And the fact we're still fuzzy about that 3 years into this invasion and more than 10 years after Russia occupied Crimea tells me that our speed of response here, ahead of analysis, same with Belt and Road, that you need to be addressing these geopolitical things a bit like you do in business, which is when there's something that's new, you've got to get your A team on it straight away to try and work out what you're seeing, what might you be getting wrong, and to decide your response. And we're very, very slow. But I mean, it's interesting. I was in the Baltic states last year, where in the summer, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs put up on its website at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening a statement that said, we demand the right to revisit all territorial boundaries in the Baltic region. Within half an hour, the Finnish Prime Minister, President, and Defence Minister had a conference call, put up on the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs a statement going, we welcome that because we've got long-standing grievances about Finnish territory that's been taken by the Russians. And then it got taken off the MFA site in Russia. So that kind of constant testing of the fences, you need to have a mechanic in place that you can respond in real time. I mean, I say that on a day where Macron's announced that he's going to go to Greenland, which probably should have done 6 months ago when Trump first mentioned it. So, I mean, by the time, again, this comes out, the United States might have annexed Greenland. But I think that speed of recognizing that where response matters, we need to be better at lining up our ducks. A couple of days ago, we've had Fiona Hill say that the UK is currently in a state of war with Russia. And that got almost no coverage anywhere in the mainstream press. It was covered in The Guardian, to be fair. But that should be setting anybody in front of a trading terminal, anybody who's in geopolitics, anybody in an NGO, anybody who lives near Russia, to ask whether she's right, but what does that mean for them?
So you've referenced some of Trump's positioning a couple of times, and you write in the epilogue that you sent me that his abrasive, derogatory and overconfident language has gone down badly in many parts of Asia, not surprisingly.
Hasn't gone down that well in Europe, I think.
Well,
but he has, to be fair, it meant that Europe now is going to invest in its defence rather than get American taxpayers to fund it. And you can't, the way he's done it has been terrible, but that's an outcome that probably we should put in the plus column.
Well, we're going to come back to Europe, in a minute, but I wondered, referencing your earlier comments about Trump, whether he is forcing many of those other nations outside of China and India to take sides, or whether they're all going to try and, play both sides of the equation.
I think from many of their perspectives, there isn't another side of the equation. That's the problem. The US seems to have degraded its global position, and reputations can be rebuilt, but it just takes a long time. So I think if you gut the State Department, as is happening, if you shut down the Voice of America, if you kill off US aid, that according to Oxfam will lead to 3 million extra deaths, 20 million children without food and schools, then you look like a less attractive partner as well as a less reliable one. So Trump is very impulsive. He says things, he then scrolls back. We're getting used to the fact, second time round, that it's a kind of Netflix box set, that there's always a cliffhanger. It's quite tiring. It's maybe narcissistic, maybe it's his personality disorder, maybe it's his skill, whichever way you want to look at it. But that noise is very unhelpful. But I think some of the discussions it's provoked is, what does the world look like when we can't rely on the US for defence, where we need to look for different trade partners? And, a lot of the growth we've seen in the last 10 years has been, for example, into ASEAN trade, how Southeast Asia is growing together without competition or without trading with the US. And I think that those will now accelerate. So, if I was Tim Cook and I had 70% of my sales, or whatever it is, 75% of my sales outside the United States, I'd be thinking quite hard about, do I repatriate the whole of my business operation and costs back to the US, where there might be a new regime or a Democrat president or a different personality who changes things. Those costs to build what I need take time. It's handling that volatility. But when you're confronted with a volatile leader, you probably do try to enhance your cooperations with your closest trading partners and with your neighbours, and that does obviously open the door to China. It opens the door for lots of conversations. Where I think ironically it opens the door for us here in the UK. And if we were more nimble, we would have enhanced, boosted up trade missions and senior politicians, doing the rounds. But I don't see them. So I was in Kazakhstan last week, and apart from the fact that my plane was filled with French ministers, Giorgia Meloni turned up the next morning on Friday, 8 o'clock in Kazakhstan. And it would be great to see Brits lean in as well. But I think we see ourselves as a financial centre where we don't need to play hardball with hard resources, but we should probably wake up and recognise that we do.
So in that European context, I think 10 billion has been committed to the Trans-Caspian transport corridor. I think you said it's going to cut journey times for freight between Europe and Central Asia by half. Europe has been given opportunity to re-engineer itself. On a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of optimism and ability to cooperate?
For Europe?
Yeah.
Look, we've got, 13 battle tanks in Europe. Probably we should, there's one American one. The problem with the amount of money that's been announced for spend into defence, German investment will go into German companies, Spanish investment will go to Spanish companies. And probably that's not the most efficient way to be investing capital. It should be what's the best of breed and how do we work out who's best at what. And maybe we should be specialists rather than all trying to be generalists. So, I think that the European project looks to me shaky. I mean, I was in with the Baltic Defence Forces 10 years ago, and I said, the risks from Russia are quantifiable, they're known. The responses that you would have are things that you've rehearsed time and time again. But I said, what I'd be worried about if I was you would be the dependency of NATO and the dependency of your European partners. And, I've been in Spain and Portugal, as I know you have recently, and some of those discussions in the defence corridors and the foreign affairs is, look, we're sympathetic to what's happening in Ukraine, but it's a long way from us and it doesn't involve us. And the way to correct that is to say, when Ukraine got invaded, food prices spiked. So we're now, globally, we're about 20% above pre-pandemic prices. Lots of different reasons. Some of it about supply, some to do with climate stress. Russia's harvest been terrible this year for lots of different crops. Unusually high spring, unusually warm spring, followed by terrible frosts. But these things are global. The global energy prices mean that we're all in it together. So I think I'm sanguine about what Europe's faults are. I don't want to talk it down, but in terms of how do we respond, I mean, I'll give you one simple fact, which is that Europe spent more money importing energy from Russia since 2022 than supporting Ukraine. And probably that's the wrong way around. If you're really serious about trying to support a country on the edge of Europe, Ukraine, that's what it means, or whether you think that Russia's not going to be a long-term competitor or threat and it's going to go away, you can let the inhabitants of Ukraine cope. My view is that world of great power competition involves all of us, and how we get onto that kind of footing, we should be talking about more.
And education, when you sit in the heart of it, accounts for 3/4 of STEM graduates. There's disaffection with US universities. I mean, you set up in Oxford. Is this a great chance to grab some, intellectual capital from the US? And we're not China, we're not the US.
Well, I'd like to say yes, and I tend to try and pull my punches when I'm talking about it, particularly with education, and because it sets people off. But Brexit hasn't killed higher education, but it's made the barrier much harder for places like my university like mine, to recruit the best talent in Europe, because it now costs 3 times more for a European to come and do their PhD or to study in Oxford than it did before Brexit, when we were part of the European Union. So that means that obviously the best talent will try to find the home that will be the most rewarding and the least financially damaging. So that puts us out of position, I think. We still have some of the very best in the world across multiple different disciplines. So we are attractive net talent. But probably if I was an enlightened government and had a magic wand and could sell it to the public, which are beyond my skill set and definitely above my job competence, finding ways to attract global talent to the UK into university sectors would seem to me like an open goal that we're going to probably fluff. Because it requires a bit of political bravery, and we've got to stay. And it avoids steering into the winds where it looks like you're looking after the elites rather than everybody else. But yeah, those opportunities are absolutely there. But again, I wrote in my book, the level of talent across STEM, engineering, AI, hard sciences, and the productivity of new papers and new research, availability of critical materials. It paints a pretty telling picture of the direction of travel. So 10 years ago, there was one Chinese university in the top 10. Now, in most of these STEM subjects, now it's 7 out of 10. So you've got to generate talent. And I mean, that goes back to the story of the Silk Road. The reason why Samarkand, Bukhara were the great, or Kaifeng or Merv were the great centers of global learning, Damascus, was because if you have wealth, you can afford to fund research in arts as well as in sciences. And that's why the United States has done so well in the 20th and 21st centuries. Harvard's endowment we look at with some jealousy, even if Trump goes for them. $65 billion, whatever it is, a pretty good cushion to fall back on. So you need to stay competitive, and you need to live on your wits rather than just assume that, because we televised the boat race, that's enough on its own. So I'm very proud of my colleagues and the work that they do. They are world class across so many different areas, but we need to preserve that pipeline and build it up rather than let it thin out.
When we think about the investing lens, we had Chris Wood on the other day actually making an interesting statement, which is he would prefer to own emerging market debt rather than G7 debt because of all sorts of the dynamics that are at play. You invest yourself. What are your priorities and preferences?
I'm risk averse. That's So I've got a few sort of attempts to try to pick out what I think might happen with quantum and emerging technologies, with edge technologies in particular, but things that might are sort of moonshots, because that I think is important to think about tomorrow as well as today. But as a historian, I think I know what lethality looks like and high mortality rates and population collapse. But so I look at the big long distance trends. So I'm much more useful, I think, to think about those. And when you read through what's coming, some of it is reasonably straightforward to predict. I mean, last year in South Korea, more strollers for pets were sold than strollers for infants, right? More adult diapers were sold in Japan and in South Korea than for kids. So you've got that demographic problem coming towards you. That's fixable. I mean, that presents lots of different problems and opportunities, right? If you want to fix pensions, if you want to fix social care and so on, there are all sorts of ways you can do it. And in fact, someone like you, Simon, would relish looking at these big numbers because you can trim those budgets reasonably efficiently. But for example, I was doing something yesterday on how the world has changed in the last 30, 40 years. In Baltic states, it's nearly 10 years greater life expectancy than since the end of the Soviet Union. Not matched men and women. Women live 10 years longer than men. Once you know that, then you might think about pension age, you might think about reform and care in different ways. In the UK, we've again exponentially got much healthier, much fitter. So retirement age 100 years ago made much more sense than today. So, I think it's how do you address those kinds of problems? And those look like they're quite a challenge, but quite exciting. But I think those fundamentals are probably going to drive the main motors of the 21st century, but it's subject to global stability, lack of war. I'm very worried about emerging infectious diseases and pandemics, not just for zoonotic and jumping into human chains, but also into food supplies. And so I'm extremely cautious about what downside looks like. If I wake up a couple of quid richer tomorrow than today, I'm very happy. What I don't want to do is lose my shirt. So I have a pretty negative view of what might happen. And that means you miss the great upswings. But there are people who are smarter than me who work out how to ride that wave. And I look at them with great admiration because you've got to be brave to take risks. But I much rather look at those big long distance trends and try and anticipate what they mean.
And if I draw some of this together, is it too simple to say that the sun rising in the east means that it's gradually setting on the west?
No, I think it's not an either or. The idea that the United States has lost position, that it's a failing economy, that looks completely crazy to me when you look at the fundamentals. When you look at the size of the U.S. economy, I mean, I am worried about the national debt and the debt ceilings and the ability for what that means for the dollar and for treasury bonds and so on. But I think that the idea that we want to make things and turn the clock back, it tells you that you feel that things are going against you. So again, in my epilogue, I've comments from people like Marco Rubio saying that the world order acts not in America's interest, it acts against it. We've seen the US voting alongside Russia at the UN, refusing to condemn a declaration against the aggression of Russia and Ukraine. And it's bewildering to see that world order seemingly go up in flames. But I think in large parts of Asia, it's kind of, if you work hard, the world of tomorrow will be better than the world of today. And that makes you invest in a different way. That makes you look for friendships in different ways. That makes you benchmark your risks in slightly different ways. So I don't think it's an either or. But here our lack of productivity, our lack of being able to scale up businesses in a way that allows us to attract IPOs, that doesn't look like the most natural home for really ambitious entrepreneurs. that does tell its own story. Apart from ASML, we haven't done a single $100 billion company in Europe for the last 40 years. And money isn't everything, although I suspect if you're listening to this podcast and have got this far in, you might disagree. But that tells you that engaging with what the global reality looks like means that we will sit in the shallow waters rather than head out into the open seas. And the open seas are where you can scale, you can frame arguments, you can win and also lose great fortunes, but you're part of the mainstream. And my worry is that Europe feels that it's becoming peripheral again, which is what its role was, by the way. I mean, if you read the Silk Roads, we weren't the centre of learning. The Dark Ages in Europe, where nothing happened between the Romans and the Battle of Hastings, and then, as far as I can tell, nothing really happened after that until Henry VIII. Then it all got exciting if you were European, because it suddenly turned out that if you were in Spain and Portugal, or France or Britain, had access to the Atlantic, the Americas, you could extract almost unlimited amounts of silver and gold. You could export almost unlimited amounts of manpower and women across the Atlantic as slaves, as enslaved labour to work for free. And that could make you rich. You could build very nice country houses in Lincolnshire and wherever you wanted. That world is now fundamentally changing. And I think it's been doing that for quite a long time, maybe 100 years, but certainly the last 20 or 30 it's accelerated.
So before I move to my rapid fire, put you on the spot questions, we can't miss out Africa. Population growth, I think, faster than anywhere else in the world. It's an important part of the equation that is often overlooked in investing circles.
Yeah, and I think we're asleep. I mean, last year, UAE put 4 times more money into Africa than China did. And that's part of energy transitions, that's part of metals, that's part of agriculture, that's part of being part of global questions and answers. I think that we're forgetting a continent that is young, has enormous amounts of potential, and significant, massive underinvestment. There are lots of historic reasons for that have deep roots and often very painful ones. But I'm sort of quite optimistic about the level and pace of change. Digitalization and renewables can accelerate some of these opportunities in lots of different parts of Africa very quickly. The question is whether governance can keep up. But I mean, China's been looking at Africa as a Russia for a long time. So I think we've now got 10 defense ministers who've been trained at the Chinese military academy. We've got about 10 heads of African nations' armed forces who've been trained with Chinese technologies and again with Chinese armed forces. And those investments are ones that I think the British used to do. At Santos, you bring in leaders from other parts of the world. You try and headhunt who you thought would be important for the future. We had lots of those pipelines through our great universities, not just Oxford and Cambridge, but to try to build up long-term alliances. And I think we've got used here in the West to people coming to us rather than going out and looking for consolidation. So that story of different parts of Africa, I think, is a really important one to factor in about how those Silk Roads are reaching into to help build up capacity in ways that will pay different kinds of dividends to different people.
Okay, so here we go. We're going general, we're going broad. You're very much in demand. Who wants you most, and how do you prioritise?
The people who are most responsive and the most interesting are always in defence. Because they have very limited budgets and they are ravenous for ideas and extremely engaged in listening, and they're great to talk to. I've never met anybody in any country where the questions aren't great and also they listen. Corporates, likewise, they've got their P&Ls to protect, so the looking for competitive advantage and looking for curiosity of ideas, particularly the more senior you go, because you've got people like you with this broad span of interests, and so they're great. Governments, by and large, are polite, but inert and take a long time to make things run through the system. And I love my academic colleagues, but we struggle sometimes to break through into the public debate and into shaping policies. So I think there's always a degree to which, when there's as a colleague of mine put it this morning, the closer you are to getting shot, the more innovative you are. And I think that people who are at the front end of pressure are being pretty quick to innovate and to think about different ways of doing things. So, some of those discussions about what do soldiers of the future look like, probably being handy with a video controller and wearing flip-flops and being able to stay awake for 22 hours in front of a screen, is probably quite a good capability that soldiers of the past didn't need to have. They need to run up Snowdon with 40 kilos on their back. Those things are changing. So I think those kinds of discussions are interesting ones.
It was Churchill, I think, who said the most exhilarating thing in the world is to be shot at without being hit. Chagos Islands, lousy deal?
Do you know what? I got asked about the Chagos Islands about 20 years ago. Ed Miliband was running to be Labour leader, and I know him a little bit, not well. And we were talking about the kinds of questions he got asked and what he needed to be prepped on. And he said, I keep getting asked about the Chagos Islands. This was, more than 10 years ago. And I said, funny you mentioned that, because I know quite a lot about the Chagos, because Diego Garcia, apart from being home to a military air base, is the only proper source of natural water in the Indian Ocean. So you can run your logistics because you don't need to be constantly bringing, either desalinating or importing vast amounts of drinking water. So I think that the long term is, how do you keep that as a Western base that is very important for the US, UK and others, and how do you keep other competitors out? But I think it looks to me that that's the kind of the first of many similar kinds of questions we're going to have. It's got a natural parallel, by the way, with the Red Sea corridor, where Qatar, Turkey, you name it, China, US, UK, France, Saudi, all are militarizing. So choke points, areas that look like that they are strategically significant, we're suddenly in an age of new competition. So our friends in Beijing, I say, figuratively, were very invested in helping Mauritius dislodge a Chagos deal. Mauritius was the first free trade deal that China did with any country in the world, because it pays great attention to what those strategic points of interest look like. So it didn't come as a great surprise to me that it suddenly hit the news a year ago, but it's something I've been looking at for a while.
Ravi Joseph, who's chair of Man Street Capital, a friend of the show, said, for a history buff who wants to visit parts of the Silk Road and see history and culture at work, what would be top of the list to visit?
Well, I should probably get that right. People sometimes talk about the Silk Road like it's the M1. There's a start and a beginning. The Silk Road was an idea about how networks work, primarily about between India, China and Central Asia, thousands of years ago. So, you could take your pick. And my view is that when we're talking about connections and long distance ones, when you start to find images of Buddha in graves in Stockholm or outside Stockholm from more than 1,000 years ago, then Stockholm can fit as part of the Silk Roads if you want it to. But I mean, the jewel sites, I guess, are in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, Bukhara, Khiva. I wouldn't ignore the glorious natural beauty of the mountains of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. All those sites in northern India in classic Central Asian style, the Taj Mahal, the tomb of Humayun, all recognisable. But I think one would try and pick the highlights. It's quite hard to beat Registan, partly because there's still not that many people there. Registan is the main square in Samarkand, and it's absolutely mind blowing in terms of the scale, the wealth, the world that once was. So it's a bit like, but go to Venice, it's the same thing, which is, particularly as an investor, why did anybody think building a palace on a canal would be a good long-term investment? So when you go to see places that were big in the past and good in the past, I dare say it might make you think twice about those nice big mansions in Notting Hill and whether people are going to walk around London in 100 years' time from different parts of the world and say, God, did people really think that was a smart way to invest their wealth? And why would they pay 30 or 40 million quid or whatever David Beckham's house costs, or others who live around that part of town? Could they not see that the world was changing? Could they not see that, it's going to be American tourists who are going to come to buy goods to take back to the US because the trade tariffs suddenly make Louis Vuitton much more expensive in the US than outside? That instead of seeing Chinese visitors at Vista Village, maybe it's going to be Americans or Brits coming to buy cut price bargain luxury goods. So I think I'd head to Samarkand and Bukhara, but there are so many parts. It's unlimited the amount of fun you can have.
You run a podcast. Which side of the microphone do you prefer to be?
Your side, asking questions, much better, because you've got to. I mean, I've learned. I love moderating because you need to think. You need to be on your toes as you always are with your guests. But also, I know how much research you do. I mean, first time you interviewed me, you were carrying like an A4 ring binder, and I was like, "Is that your memoirs you're writing?" My first 3 months at Morgan Stanley, and to do your research so you can get someone to talk. It's a real skill. So I love doing that. I'm not mad about being put on the spot, which is why I give quite long answers. But I don't write books very often, and I also don't come out to play and talk about my work to anybody and all the time. But what Moneymaze has done, which has been so fantastic, is to focus on such an important part of not just investing, but to try to globalize, to try to think about these big picture stuff. And you do it so well week after week. So no, I'm very happy to come here, but I'd probably, on balance, prefer your job of asking the questions, because getting someone to talk is also it's a joy.
Well, that's very nice of you and very honest of you. So the last two questions, of course, come from Will Campion. I don't know why he thinks they should concern sport and alcohol. I don't know if that's any reflection of him or you. But he did say, drinks cabinet. We have one here in the studio now. Were you offered a martini, a Negroni, or a Walschmidt Kümmel? Which would it be?
I think I'd take a martini, but I wouldn't let Will Campion mix it, because I think when we had the first time we were out of unlocked in lockdown, I had a very bad martini experience where I'd like to blame Will. I'm sure he'd blame me, and probably he's right thinking about it. Where sort of one of those, and I was talking even more gibberish than usual. So no, martini is my go-to. I mean, I know Kümmel, there's a bit of a thing going on at the moment, but I think when I'm in an airport lounge and I've got a flight, that's what'll knock me out.
And that's because we have the Walschmidt Kümmel brand that has been, brought back to life by Will Campion and a few other shareholders, of which I declare to be one. And it's coming to a store near you. So finally, given your sports skill and enthusiasm,
I've been oversold, but yeah, go on.
You can only have 2 tickets: Roland Garros next year, World Cup football final, or the Olympics.
Oh, I think the Olympics. I mean, I would take any of those. If anybody out there can't make it and has tickets. I mean, I love going to sports events, but the Olympics has been a very important part of our family life. I mean, all these sports, we're very lucky. Our kids love watching sports. I mean, funny enough, it's almost as good a question, Simon, which is, what's the best invention of the last 50 years? I'd put Sky Sports, or televised sports, right up there, because it's a joy to watch people who are the best in the world giving everything. And we've been lucky enough to go to a few Olympics as a family group, and I love the fact that the level of competition is not just with the Olympics. It's not just about winning or losing. The placing is important, whereas in football and with tennis, there's always a winner and a loser, which is brutal. I mean, that's life, I suppose. But I've got a real soft spot for the Olympics. We did a great job here when it was in London. I went last year in Paris to loads of events, including the women's golf. We went to the water polo finals. I was on the computer as soon as tickets were released, and it was a real joy. So I think Olympics. I mean, that's, God has blessed Trump. I mean, these are his words, by the way, not mine. When he said that maybe he thought twice that maybe he didn't win the election in 2020, because now he gets to be president for a football World Cup in the US, for Olympics in the US, and for the 250th anniversary of the United States independence, and as a kind of legacy moment to preside over. As though Trump didn't like the camera enough, that puts him in a kind of amazing place to be able to get the tickets to everything he wants. So that's one reason I'm jealous of Donald J. Trump.
Well, we are going to close. I sometimes conclude, but I mean, I'd be taking notes that would run to pages if I had to bring all these conclusions. I'm just going to say it's been 4 years since you were on. It's so nice to see you. You make the world a better place by your writings, thinkings, and sharing your thoughts. So thank you for being here.
It's very generous. If it was a little bit later in the day, I'd crack the martinis. Thanks
Next time.
Really great.
So, Peter, we recorded our conversation only a few weeks ago. If a week is a long time in politics, certainly in your area of expertise, there's been a lot of change. So we wanted to come back and just do an update with regard to Iran. I think it's particularly topical what's happened, and you have just been at the NATO summit at The Hague with President Trump, so you're extremely well placed. So let's just keep it a really simple opening question. How do you appraise Iranian-related developments of the last week?
We recorded before Israel had launched its attacks on Iran. I mean, last September 2024, Israel had basically wiped most of Iran's air defences out of action. And so there was a kind of obvious window of opportunity where the military in Israel, who'd been planning for this for years, I think in the expectation that they might have 1 or 2 shots at different bits and pieces, as it happened, as the kind of nuclear talks kept on going between Trump and Iran, as we spoke about, it looked to me that there was a reasonable chance of a breakthrough. They were due to meet in Oman for the 6th round of talks. And I think that all the military plans then got pushed forward by Israel to say, if an agreement got made with the US and Iran, that would take away any opportunity that Israel would ever had. So that window was closing. So the attacks took out all of what was left of Iran's defences. The embedding of Mossad and Israel's security services, military intelligence, was absolutely critical, so that they knew where everybody was at all times. So that has given operational superiority that allowed, over the course of the following 12 days, Israel to knock down every single thing it thought it could do, except for hitting the three big installations at Fordow, at Isfahan, and at Natanz. There's been a lot of discussion about how bad the damage was. I think the fact that Trump was willing to use force and to put B-2s in the sky and hit Iran has shown that he is not perhaps always chickening out, as everybody's been saying, but he understands what you do when you've got a counterparty who is defenseless. So Iran then put missiles back into the sky over Doha in a pre-coordinated attack to sort of show that it needed to do something back in return. But Iran has been teetering at the knees. So now Israel's probably achieved all it needs to. We're at the delta where there's not much point of going even deeper into Iran sort of society and senior figures. It's what's a new deal look like, and all those moving parts, because it's 3D chess. The bits that I've been paying attention to, and this might all change in the few days before this comes out, is Trump saying it's okay for China to buy Iranian oil, and that there's a bigger three-dimensional chess game going on where Russia's part of the equation, India's part of the equation, China's part of the equation, and what now needs to be done is a delicate threading of the needle that gives Iran an off-ramp, but allows for de-escalation, not just of nuclear, but allows perhaps some of those bigger reforms that people have been looking for in Iran, that those might come forward too. But my guess would be that in fact, Iran will now go through a period of repression, of looking for dissidents, trying to iron out the kind of loose stones in the wall that allowed so many of their movements of the scientists and the military to be known. So it's a very much a position in flux, but the US use of force is absolutely critical.
So there are always quantum leaps of conclusion from many so-called experts, but there has been this groundswell of opposition to this aging theocracy in Iran for some time. Do you think that this might stir up those Iranians, of whom there appear to be many, who are cross at this regime pursuing the sort of the ideological dogma they've had about the destruction of Israel, and that the nuclear state has had to be the sort of the golden ambition?
Look, the Iranian world is very young, median age, very tech savvy, lots of ways of getting around past through VPNs to understand what's going on in the world. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of fear, obviously, but I think there are lots of voices that are saying that just because the Iranian regime is repressive and difficult, that actually being knocked out like this by Israel and by the US is, it's shameful that Iran is in this position. So the idea that there maybe should be that Iran does need a bomb, the idea that Iran does need better military forces, is something that finds a lot of support. Having said that, don't underestimate, if you have full control of state media and of basically the digital connections, you can both influence public opinion but also monitor what's going on. So, I mean, in fact, one of the discussions about, in the network world, are when there were revolts in 2022, 2023 about whether women should have to cover their hair after dissidents were put in prison and killed. When you find protests, if you're a surveillance state, it's quite useful to know where those pockets of opposition are. So I think it's a split world. There was lots of social media activity in Iran as the bombings were going on, saying if Iran had spent more time thinking about its defense rather than persecuting women, then maybe they'd have had a better chance of standing up to Israel. But being kneecapped and humiliated by one of your neighbors who you've been told is the great Satan is also suboptimal for young people as well. So, lots of people have been predicting the rise of a rebellion that would overthrow the regime, but probably slow reform probably is better than revolution. But let's see.
And how do you weigh up? I mean, the assertions that came out of the administration very quickly were of the unquestionable success, and then we get this leaked report, followed by so much discrediting by Trump that you think the sort of the man protesteth too much. Does it matter if, in fact, we discover in the next few months that it wasn't such an impressive bunker busting, expedition?
I think not really. I mean, over the coming months and years to rebuild, like we all know, it's a question of time, leadership, and money. And but there are plenty of, maybe not friends of Iran, but plenty of other states around the world who think that two nuclear states launching a first for preemptive action against Iran, in claiming it to be self-defense, that's not what international law should look like. So Iran will find lots of corners where it'll find sympathy. I mean, what's interesting is that China and Russia both issued statements condemning the violence, but didn't offer meaningful support, logistics or otherwise. But I think it's a changing world. I think any state in the world right now is worried that they may be next on the menu. And lots of voices in that Asian world that we spoke about when we recorded it, how they see the West, rightly or wrongly, and possibly rightly, is that we are very keen to shoot first and ask questions second. And that the interventions, when you tot up Iran now, Iraq, Afghanistan, the ways in which we try to reshape the world in the order that suits us, that is in a state of change. So Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, when his confirmation hearings, he said the post-World War II order is not only obsolete, but it's used as a weapon against the United States. So that forging of a new world order means lots of different things to lots of different people, and we shouldn't kid ourselves in the West that we're just trying to keep the rules of the club and of the game in our favour. Those are all, I think, ways in which people are going to sit up and work out what do they want and need. But the model of Iran, message of Iran is, if you want to be independent, have a nuclear bomb because people don't attack you. If you look like you nearly have a nuclear bomb, then you're in trouble.
So the final question I have to ask, since I found myself in heated debate with my son, was about the end justifying the means. How, as a historian, do you think we will reflect on US intervention?
It depends what happens in the coming weeks and months. Turning points are very easy to pick out, in real time, and in fact they don't turn into much. The bit that I'm worried about is always about what happens on the periphery, the kind of black swan events, like Sarajevo in 1914, where 2 weeks beforehand, one of the senior British diplomats had said he'd never seen the waters of Europe so calm. And then Austrian Archduke gets shot by a totally random person, or by a Serbian nationalist, and then the seismic shocks that lead to the Russian Revolution, collapse of empires, you name it. I think that those are the things I'm paying a lot of attention to, of a sudden bump in the road. At the moment, we're talking markets they've all recovered. They're within 1% of their highest ever marks. The markets didn't react at all to what's happened. And so we all think that it's business as usual. But some of those undercurrents, I think, are much more severe and serious than we're pricing in. So it's what might go wrong that suddenly throws things off is what I think we should be thinking about.
Well, I really appreciate you coming back for that top up and sharing those thoughts. And two questions I didn't ask you outside of this, which I'm going to now ask you, which is, lots of would-be aspiring authors and writers will have enjoyed watching and listening to you in the whole episode. What advice would you give to a young person who thinks that they might have a future which involves writing? Get on with it. Write. Lots of authors have an idea up their sleeve. Put it on the page. Then worry about it. I think that's the first thing. And sometimes the academic world. My horror when I was a graduate student was that the people who were the cleverest had never written their magnum opus. They were always waiting for it to be perfect, because I guess they were worried that it would be, how it would be judged or reviewed. But just, I think, get on with it and give it a go. And also podcasts. Nothing wrong with those, Simon. The way of communicating complex ideas in a way that's interesting, digestible, and not everybody's got time on their hands. So finding different ways to communicate. Maybe writing books goes alongside being able to give lectures and come on podcasts and talk about their ideas. And just as a reminder to our audience, in fact, your own podcast is terrific, and I hate to get people drawn away from the Money Maze podcast, but it is, Money Maze is the only show in town. Everybody knows that. They wouldn't have got to this part of the podcast to hear that. So keep listening. Don't do anything else. Okay, so the final question is there a summit for Peter Frankopan still to scale? Yeah, there's the Money Maze conference coming up in end of September. That I've been tentatively lined up, and I've seen my name in pencil. In fact, I've even seen my name in ink. So I'm hoping that's not just you being polite to me, but that's the next feather in my cap. Well, fantastic! You've done our PR. We're going to let you go, Peter. Thank you once more. Thanks a lot.